What's the creepiest thing that's ever happened to you at work? I used to work at a massive family entertainment center. The place had everything: a huge arcade, bowling alleys, and the main attraction, a multi-level laser tag facility. Almost every employee there talked about the building being haunted. I never believed a single word of it. I am just not the type of person who buys into the whole paranormal thing. At least, I did not until I started my regular shifts inside that laser tag arena. If you have ever played laser tag, you know the drill. The entire maze is lit up exclusively by deep black lights and neon paint. Because of that layout, when those specialized lights are turned off, the arena plunges into absolute pitch black darkness. It is the kind of heavy dark where you literally cannot see your own hand right in front of your face. We always worked completely alone in that section of the building. One single employee was responsible for everything. You had to explain the safety rules to the crowd in room number 1. Then you moved them to room number 2 to help them get vested up in their glowing gear. Finally, you had to step inside the maze to referee the actual match. The layout was pretty specific. There was a small, cramped employee office located inside room number 2, sitting directly across from the heavy vinyl door that led straight into the playing arena. It is also important to note that the arena had a pair of emergency exit doors at the very back. Those doors led out to a completely unlit section of the rear parking lot. They remained heavily locked from the inside at all times, equipped with loud pressure alarms in case of an emergency. My very first real scare happened on my first night closing the facility completely by myself. The arcade noises outside had faded, and the entire back section was dead silent. I was cleaning up room number 2 when suddenly, one of the laser tag vests, which had been marked as out of order all day long, did something impossible. It was sitting 100% properly and securely on its metal rack. Out of nowhere, the heavy vest came flying up and completely over the top of the rack. It slammed hard onto the concrete floor, violently ripping its charging cable straight out of the wall socket. The sudden impact caused the vest's internal software to malfunction, making the chest pieces violently kick on and flash in the dark. It scared the absolute hell out of me. The second incident occurred on Halloween night in the year 2013. The facility was packed, so management put a coworker back there to help me run the register outside while I stayed in the small office checking the battery levels on the equipment. There were no active games running at that moment. Every single room in the back was totally empty. Suddenly, a heavy sound broke the silence. It sounded exactly like someone wearing heavy boots, sprinting at full speed up the wooden ramp that led straight towards the vesting room. I froze in my chair, staring intently at the arena door. I fully expected it to burst open and see a customer or coworker run through. Instead, the frantic footsteps stopped right outside my wall. Everything went completely silent for a fraction of a second. Then, there was an incredibly loud, booming bang against the partition. I jumped out of my seat and screamed. I sprinted out of the office to grab my coworker from the front register. When he opened the arena door to check the room, we found a single worn-out tennis shoe sitting right in the middle of the floor. It definitely was not there 5 minutes before. We searched every corner of the facility, but we never found the other matching shoe. To this day, that missing detail still bothers me every time I think about it. But the creepiest thing happened a few weeks later. 2 of our regular customers were at the facility for their weekly bowling league, and they paid for their 2 kids to play a round of laser tag. The little girl was about 5 or 6 years old, and her older brother was probably 7 or 8. Since it was just the 2 of them, they begged me to step into the maze and play a match against them. I was 19 at the time, and since the place was empty, I agreed. Midway through the game, the little girl popped around a neon corner. I immediately noticed that her vest was completely turned off. That is technically impossible unless someone manually inputs a hard reset command into the master computer back in the office. A second later, the booming arena music suddenly cut to dead silence. I immediately started flipping out. I knew the black lights would probably go next, leaving us stranded in the dark maze. I was absolutely convinced that an intruder had snuck into our private office and was messing with the main terminal. I ran out of the arena, threw the office door open, but the room was completely empty. The computer system had just completely crashed. It had never done that before. I called the kids out of the maze to reset their gear. The little girl looked pale. She looked up at me and said she was too scared to keep playing. I told them it was totally fine and promised to refund their parents' bowling account. As I was helping her unbuckle the heavy straps of her vest, she looked at me with wide eyes and said, "Hey, I have a question." I asked her what was on her mind. She looked back at the open arena door and whispered, "Who was that man in there playing the game with us?" My blood ran cold. There was absolutely no one else in that building except for me and those two kids. I kept my voice calm and told her that there was nobody else inside the maze. She shook her head firmly, grabbed my hand, and walked me right back to the threshold of the dark arena. She opened the door, pointed her small finger straight up towards the top of the dark wooden ramp, and said, "See? He is right there!" I strained my eyes, staring into the dim neon shadows. I told her I could not see anything at all. She turned her head to look at me, looking completely confused, and said, "How can you not see him? His hair is literally glowing." Cultural note: laser tag facilities utilize specific high-intensity black lights that emit long-wave ultraviolet light. This specific wavelength interacts with fluorescent materials, causing them to emit visible light, while making non-reactive organic matter and deep shadows blend completely into the surrounding darkness, significantly distorting human peripheral vision and depth perception during prolonged exposure. I have worked with senior Alzheimer patients for quite some time. When you are covering the graveyard shift in a care facility, your ears get used to all sorts of weird sounds echoing down the empty halls. Some noises are completely familiar and harmless, while others immediately signal that you need to stand up and investigate. One particular night, the facility was completely dead silent. Then, an incredibly unsettling recurring sound started cutting through the quietness of the corridor. It sounded exactly like a bare-skinned human limb being slowly dragged over the cold linoleum floor. It would happen once, followed by a heavy, thick silence. Then, a slow, agonizing slide drag. Then more silence. Absolutely nothing else could be heard in the entire building, just that creepy, rhythmic sound slowly but surely approaching my station. I sat frozen behind my desk, closely watching the open doorway that led into the nurse's post. My eyes were glued to the floor lights spilling into the hallway. Then, achingly slow, a single leg appeared on the ground. It was completely naked and bone-thin, dragging itself closer and closer while producing that awful friction noise against the vinyl. But there was only one leg moving forward. Humans are naturally bipedals, so the visual composition was totally jarring to my brain. The next thing I saw were two scrawny, pale hands tightly clutching the wooden doorframe from the floor level. A split second later, a slightly smiling human head pushed out from the lower side to look directly into my eyes. Long, unkempt gray hair hung loosely from a face that resembled a literal skull-like frame. She had remarkably big, unblinking insect eyes and that deranged, wide grin plastered across her face. She stared right at me from the floor, widening her grin even more. Then she started to beg over and over again in a raspy whisper, "Kill me! Kill me!" All of this was delivered while she kept smiling like an absolute maniac in the dim light. You may wonder why I did not stand up to go investigate the noise much earlier. Well, the truth is that I actually knew that specific old lady quite well. She was always wide awake in the middle of the night, regularly shuffling around on the ground instead of sleeping. It was just her standard way of saying her special hello to the staff from time to time. During the afternoon hours, She was always sweet and smiling, but if you tried to intervene or force her back into her bed at night, her demeanor would shift instantly. She could get quite physically aggressive. In fact, she had recently tried hitting several of my medical colleagues with her heavy prosthetic leg. Otherwise, she really was a total sweetie, just definitely not at 2 a.m. Cultural note: advanced stages of Alzheimer's disease can severely disrupt the body's internal circadian rhythm, leading to a phenomenon known as sundowning. This clinical state often induces intense nocturnal wakefulness, spatial disorientation, and extreme behavioral changes, causing patients to reject standard ambulatory assistance or mobility devices during late-night hours. I used to work for a local citizen advice-style agency. My daily responsibilities involved sitting down and conducting one-on-one interviews with members of the general public. Every single day, we would get random people walking straight off the street looking for immediate assistance. Our office helped the community with a wide variety of serious personal issues. We handled complicated city taxes, applications for social housing, and other critical welfare matters. I should probably add that this took place over in the United Kingdom. One quiet afternoon, I got a standard phone call from the front desk receptionist. She asked me to come down to the lobby because a new walk-in client needed immediate assistance. When I walked out, I saw a young, fairly clean-cut guy sitting on the bench. He looked completely ordinary, wearing normal clothes, and did not raise any initial red flags. I greeted him and led him into a private side room so we could discuss his case in absolute confidence. The layout of that specific room was highly flawed. The heavy wooden desk directly faced the main exit door. My office chair sat all the way at the back, pinned completely against the solid brick wall. We both sat down. I pulled out my notepad and asked him what specific issues he was currently concerned about. That was the exact moment the atmosphere in the room completely shifted. The young man opened his mouth and started talking, but he made absolutely no sense, zero intelligible sense. It was just a continuous rapid-fire stream of rambling word salad. It was total crazy talk. I managed to catch a few frantic words about a massive, coordinated conspiracy against his life. It became instantly clear that I was trapped in a tiny enclosed space with someone suffering from a fairly intense acute paranoid delusion. I knew I had to handle the situation with extreme caution. I just started nodding my head, agreeing with every wild statement he made, trying my absolute best to stay on his good side. I did not even attempt to process the details of his words. Honestly, no human being could have mapped that level of chaos. I have never been so profoundly scared in my entire professional life. Terrified would actually be a much better description for what I felt. It is incredibly difficult to explain the raw, visceral horror of being basically cornered by an unstable individual. There was absolutely no way out of that room except by pushing directly past his body. He had completely lost his grip on objective reality. My heart was hammering violently against my ribs. I was just praying to God that he would not suddenly snap, look across the table, and decide that I was somehow part of the conspiracy against him. I kept my voice incredibly low and calm. I slowly managed to talk him down from his peak agitation, promising him that I would personally look into his case, whatever on earth it actually was. I successfully mollified his anger just enough to usher him back out into the open safety of the main lobby. I quickly instructed him to leave his contact details with the front desk receptionist before getting him to exit the front doors. The very second the glass doors clicked shut behind him, the adrenaline completely crashed. I remember standing there in the lobby as a wave of cold sweat literally made my cotton shirt stick to my back. I left that government job a long time ago, but from that terrifying afternoon onward, I never again made the mistake of sitting in an office without giving myself a clear, unobstructed line of escape if things go south. Cultural note: citizen advice offices in the United Kingdom strictly operate under official workplace violence prevention protocols. Following extensive occupational risk assessments during the early 2000s, British administrative guidelines mandated a specific transversal desk layout. This safety protocol dictates that the staff member must always sit closest to the exit door, ensuring an unobstructed line of escape and preventing physical entrapment during volatile face-to-face interactions. I used to work the night shift at my dad's truck rental business. For about 2 full weeks, I started noticing a specific worn-out car parked at the far end of our concrete lot. There was always a lone man sitting inside that vehicle, just staring toward our main entrance. My coworkers and I just kind of shrugged our shoulders every morning. We assumed he was just waiting for someone and thought absolutely nothing of it. That naive comfort completely shattered one chilly evening. I happened to be the absolute last person to leave the building after completing my closing shift. As I walked out into the dim lighting of the lot, the car door clicked open. The man hobbled out of his vehicle, moving with a noticeable limp, and waved his hand to call me over. He claimed he just wanted to ask me a quick question about our business. The moment I stepped closer, I realized he had zero actual questions about my company. The only work-related thing he asked was what exact time our office closed for the night, which was a detail he obviously already knew from watching us for 14 days. The rest of his words were highly unsettling personal questions. He kept asking for my full name, the exact neighborhood where I lived, and what I liked to do during my free time. Then his tone took a manipulative turn. He pointed down at his physical disability and stated that, because of his condition, I could not possibly be mean enough to turn him down when he asked for my personal phone number. A vital detail of that night is that the guy started taking calculated steps to corner me against the wall. Luckily, I wasn't completely defenseless. I had 3 massive dogs with me, a Great Dane, my English Mastiff, and my dad's Irish Setter mix. As it turned out, my dad had taken all of them to the vet that day for their annual vaccination. That afternoon, he ended up leaving them at the office because an unexpected errand came up, and he asked me to drive them back home at the end of my shift. I managed to keep all 3 animals firmly lined up as a physical barrier between him and me, all while feeling my heartbeat echoing in my ears. To finally get out of the situation, I looked at him and gave him a completely fake phone number. Instead of backing off, the man took an aggressive step directly toward me. That was the exact threshold for my English Mastiff, Meaty. He instantly dropped his head, raised his thick hackles, and let out a deep, rumbling, terrifying growl from the bottom of his chest. That powerful sound was more than enough to shatter the man's confidence. He immediately turned around, stumbled back to his sedan, and turned the key. I scrambled into my own vehicle, started the engine, and intentionally drove in the complete opposite direction of my actual home to make sure he could not follow me to my driveway. The very next morning, management established a strict new safety policy. No employee was ever allowed to leave the building alone after dark, and our male co-workers had to escort everyone out to their vehicles. We also agreed that if any stranger ever came into the lobby asking for me by name, the staff was instructed to hide me in the back room immediately and force the person to leave a written message. Even today, so many years later, I still find myself turning the exact same question over and over in my head. If that absolute freak had been watching my every move from his car for 14 whole days, how could he have been so incredibly stupid? What kind of twisted logic made him think that that day of all days was the perfect moment to try and corner me? He was looking right at not 1 but 3 large dogs, including the massive, intimidating frame of my English Mastiff, standing like a 200-pound wall directly between us. Only a completely blind level of obsession, or a total detachment from reality, could explain why he chose to take that step forward, completely ignoring the fact that he was just a single heartbeat away from being torn to shreds. My big Mastiff, Meaty, was a ridiculous dog who was genuinely terrified of metal spoons and his own plastic food bowl, but he did his job perfectly when my life was on the line. Cultural note: large working breeds like English Mastiffs and Great Danes possess an innate territorial instinct and can perceive subtle changes in human adrenaline, posture, and vocal tension. When an individual displays predatory cornering behavior, these dogs bypass their standard domestic training to establish a physical barrier, utilizing low-frequency vocalizations as an apex warning mechanism before initiating defense. Like what you see? Subscribe to the Reddit Oracle for more. I used to work behind the counter at a busy liquor store, and one evening, a specific group of men walked through the front doors. The second they stepped into the light, my instincts flagged them. I am almost completely certain they were part of a neo-Nazi group. Every single one of them was remarkably large, heavily built, and possessed a very intimidating presence. The main leader of the group had a completely shaved head, a massive thick beard, and almost every single inch of his skin was covered in intense tattoos, leaving only his direct face bare. To my surprise, they were actually totally polite and nice to me while making their purchase. But the real terror came from how they reacted to the other customers inside the building at that exact moment. There were a few regular people of various skin colors and different ethnicities browsing the back aisles. I will absolutely never forget the chilling look that came over the faces of those large men when they noticed them. It was a cold, predatory stare. The only way I can honestly describe it is like a silent promise that said, I am going to watch that person die slowly, and I am going to thoroughly enjoy every single second of it. The psychological tension in the room became incredibly heavy. I genuinely felt like those guys could have whipped out high-caliber firearms, laid waste to those innocent people right on the tile floor, and then calmly turned back around to keep talking to me normally, like absolutely nothing had happened. My hands were shaking under the counter. I just tried to process their transaction as fast as humanly possible to get them out of my station. About an hour after they finally walked out, I heard some disturbing news from the local authorities. There had been a violent physical altercation at another retail store located in the exact same parking lot, specifically involving a group of neo-Nazis. Knowing the timing and the heavy, dangerous energy they brought with them, it is very likely that it was the exact same group of men. Cultural note: extremist or supremacist groups often utilize specific iconography and tattoos, known as hate codes, to identify one another within urban environments. The use of shaved heads alongside visible numerical or runic symbols functions as a mechanism of passive intimidation in commercial public spaces, which typically alerts private security systems and local authorities due to the high risk of violent altercations. I used to work as a tour guide for a local ghost tour company. My job was pretty straightforward. I walked groups of tourists through the darkest alleys of the city after sunset. We would stop right in front of important historical landmarks. Then, I would tell them the most gruesome, detailed stories about the tragedies and the reported hauntings tied to those places. Weird things happened quite often during the graveyard shift. Guests would sometimes freeze and point at the upper floors, claiming they saw pale faces peering out of the dark windows. Others would whisper to me about strange, faint lights floating inside abandoned buildings. But the absolute creepiest thing that ever happened to me occurred on my very last night on the clock. I was leading a group of about 15 people. We were standing right on the stone steps, directly in front of the heavy wooden door of a notorious historical house. The place was famous for its dark history, and the cold night air made the atmosphere feel incredibly heavy. I finished my final monologue, delivered the last chilling detail, and then smiled at the crowd. I thanked the guests for their time. I announced to the group that this was officially my final tour with the company. Everyone smiled and started clapping. The cheerful sound echoed against the old stone walls. I turned around and started to make my way down the steep, slick steps. That was the exact moment the air behind me turned freezing cold. Out of nowhere, I heard a faint, raspy voice whisper something indistinguishable right into my ear. It felt like someone was standing close enough to touch me. Before I could even turn my head to look, I felt a heavy, violent pair of solid hands shoved me hard right between my shoulder blades. I completely lost my balance. I went flying forward, tumbling head over heels down the concrete stairs. Luckily, a guy in the front row of the crowd reacted fast and caught me before my head hit the pavement. I was shaking, my heart pounding against my ribs. I immediately looked back up at the top of the stairs. The landing was completely empty. There was absolutely nobody behind me. The wildest part is that some of the guests actually started laughing and clapping even harder. They genuinely assumed that my violent fall and me panicking about being pushed by thin air was just a rehearsed special effect to end the tour. It was a great job with amazing tips, but that final tour was completely insane. Cultural note: ghost tours in historic American cities often take place around structural landmarks built during the 18th and 19th centuries. These old properties frequently feature steep, narrow exterior staircases made of unpolished stone or brick, which can retain moisture and create severe slip hazards during night hours, making physical accidents common in the darkness. I used to work the graveyard shift at a small boutique hotel. The property had a really dark, depressing history. Before investors bought it, the place had been a very shady truck stop-style motel. It even served as an AIDS hospice for a while. It was generally known as a highly unseemly place. During the late-night hours, the setup was completely isolating. The only people on staff were myself and the bartenders, but their lounge was located all the way on the opposite side of the massive property. The front desk and the lobby where I stationed myself had been carved out of a couple of old guest rooms. This was located in the largest building on the lot. The back office area was a private room that opened directly into the main lobby. If you walked through a heavy door at the very back of that office, you entered a small, cramped room containing a single desk and a private bathroom. That particular night, the atmosphere felt completely off. The front desk area was usually freezing cold, but it kept suddenly heating up. Out of nowhere, the space would fill with this thick, hot, suffocating air. The main AC unit was positioned right outside the office door, and I could hear the compressor running perfectly. The digital temperature gauge on the wall consistently read in the low 70s. When I stood up and checked the metal vents with my bare hand, the airflow felt totally cool. Yet every once in a while, a heavy blast of hot air would slowly pass through the room. I was not too bothered at first. Commercial AC units act up all the time. Plus, there was an old, uninsulated attic sitting right above the ceiling tiles that might trap the midday heat. I just brushed it off and focused on my paperwork. But as the night shift dragged on, I started to develop a really intense, heavy feeling of psychological uneasiness. My survival instincts were actively screaming at me. Every single time I stepped in and out of that smaller back room with the bathroom, my skin would crawl. I would feel this overwhelming sensation that someone was standing right behind my shoulder. I could almost feel their breathing on my neck. I would violently turn around to defend myself, but of course absolutely nothing would be there, just empty, heavy shadows. By the absolute end of my shift, I felt completely unnerved and trembling. Between the random, scorching blasts of dry heat and the oppressive feeling of being watched by invisible eyes all night, I was a total mess. The moment my relief arrived, I grabbed my keys. I could not get out of that office fast enough. The very next afternoon, when I clocked back into work, I decided to approach my manager. I casually asked her if anything weird or tragic had ever happened around the main lobby area. Without even skipping a single beat, she looked up and answered casually, "Oh yeah. There was a horrible fire inside that exact space back when this place was still a roadside motel." She explained that the back room of our current office used to be the previous manager's private living quarters. One night, the guy was smoking a heavy cigarette in bed, fell fast asleep, and the mattress caught fire. The smoke completely overcame him. He never managed to get out of the room, and he ended up dying right there in the flames. When the new owners started the structural renovations to repair the charring, they decided to merge the damaged rooms into our current front office. And that is the exact moment I learned my quiet hotel job was completely haunted. I have a close friend who was forced to leave his workplace without insurance or an alarm, leaving him unprotected for an entire night due to an extremely terrifying situation he experienced on his shift. He worked as the main night barman inside a very small and incredibly old historical theater in our city. Because of his specific role, he was always the absolute last person to leave the entire building after hours. He had to cash up the register, clean down the sticky counters, and secure the inventory. The theater was widely reputed to be heavily haunted by the locals. There was even a small, centuries-old group of historical graves located directly on the property grounds. One particular night, he had already waved off the rest of the stage staff and the last of the regular theater-goers. He went ahead and locked the heavy front entrance doors from the inside, so he was completely alone at the bar doing his closing routine. As he was standing there cashing up the register, he had his back completely turned to the dark open seating room. Out of nowhere, he distinctively heard and felt a massive vibration, exactly as if a heavy individual had jumped hard on the spot right behind his shoulder. He was completely freaking out internally, his chest tightening with panic, but he forced himself not to react at all externally. He decided he would just slowly get the hell out of there and sort out the cash register the next morning. He made his way calmly down the corridor toward the cellar to retrieve his winter coat and his personal bag. In this old building, the cellar was actually a room located on the same main level, but positioned down a dark hallway. The staff still called it the cellar because it functioned as the heavily chilled barrel and keg storage room. The air inside that room felt freezing and heavy. As he reached out his hand and was just about to pick up his bag and coat, a heavy metal hammer suddenly shot off a nearby workbench. The tool flew violently many feet clean across the room and landed with a loud metallic smash right next to his boots. That was his absolute breaking point. He completely abandoned his belongings, turned on his heels, and sprinted out of that hallway at full speed. He reached the front entrance, frantically unbarred the heavy security lock that he had set earlier, and busted out into the street. Since his keys were still inside his bag back in the chilling room, the front doors remained completely unlocked, and the main security alarm was never set for the entire night. The next morning, he woke up to an incredibly angry phone call from his boss. The owner had turned up to open the building and found the entrance wide open, exactly as it had been left during the chaotic escape. I do not think he actually lost his job over the security breach, but he ended up quitting anyway very soon after that shift. He just could not be bothered dodging flying tools at work after midnight every single night, and honestly, I do not blame him at all. There is a lot of talk among the staff on the medical units about the nuns. Everyone calls them the permanent ghosts of the building because this place is a very old historic hospital. To be clear, there are no actual living nuns working at the hospital anymore. According to the rumors, there is the white ghost and there is the black ghost. The names refer specifically to the distinct color of the heavy fabrics they wear. Patients and nursing staff all talk about these entities constantly. Patients who are actively on their deathbeds will always describe seeing them exactly the same way. The white nun is widely known as a comforting spirit. She is usually spotted quietly stepping into the room of a patient who desperately needs peace or pain relief. The black ghost is, as you probably guessed, the omen of death. One evening, I was sitting on the break couch during a long night shift in the palliative unit, which is where the terminal patients are kept. However, I was specifically stationed on the long-term care side. This meant the patients over there were still considered stable and pretty far away from actively passing away. As I rested my eyes, I saw a tall figure dressed in a long, solid black dress walk smoothly into the private room of one of the elderly men. I had just checked on that exact room 5 minutes prior. The man was completely fine, and he had no registered visitors scheduled. In fact, he had no family members left alive and never received any visitors at all. I got a bit nosy and quietly walked over to peep into his doorway. I wanted to see who on earth could possibly be visiting him, since he had absolutely nobody in the world. But the moment I pushed the door open and stepped into the room, his spirit was gone. The elderly man had just passed away in his sleep. To this day, a full 10 years later, I am still completely convinced that was the black nun paying him her final visit. I had another strange experience on that same medical unit. That night, I was working on the short-term side of the floor. I was standing in the corridor, staring blankly at this creepy old china cabinet filled with porcelain dolls that families had donated over the long years. The back wall of the cabinet was lined with a large mirror, and I could clearly see my own reflection in the dim glass. As I stared, I suddenly saw the clear reflection of my favorite elderly patient standing right behind my shoulder. I immediately turned around to say something cheerful to him, but he was gone. Just like that. Poof. There was a very long, empty hallway extending behind me. There was absolutely nowhere for a 95-year-old patient with a walker to quickly run and hide. I walked down the hall to his room, fully intending to give him a bit of heck for sneaking up and scaring me like that. But when I pushed the door open, there he was. He was lying completely still, passed away in his bed. The head nurse informed me he had already been gone for about 20 minutes. His family was already gathered around the mattress grieving over him, and the staff nurse was there going over the next administrative steps. Cultural note. Historically, many early American medical facilities founded during the 19th and early 20th centuries were established and operated by religious orders, particularly Catholic sisters. These institutions often featured a specific layout with long corridors, wooden furniture, and memorial displays, which remain intact even after modern secular organizations take over administrative control. I used to work at a massive thrift store in my city. Most of the time, my main responsibility was tending to the back donation door, which meant helping local residents who drove by to drop off their old stuff. The retail store officially closed its doors at 9 o'clock in the evening, but after about 7 o'clock, the entire back area cleared out, and I was usually the only employee left working inside the donation center. Donations from the public were very few and far between at that late hour. However, company policy stated that I absolutely could not leave the main entrance unattended. To pass the time, I would occupy myself with plenty of tedious busy work. I spent my hours organizing the ever-present mess of donated boxes, sweeping the dusty warehouse floor, or doing whatever else kept me moving. The specific door where people came to drop off their heavy items was one of those standard automatic sliding double doors that you so often see at large grocery stores. The mechanism relied on a motion sensor installed right above the glass frame, and it would often slide completely open when there was absolutely nothing outside to trip the infrared sensor. I would look out into the empty dark alley, and the doors would just slowly open and close on their own. To make things stranger, the landline phone mounted right by the door frame would ring from time to time, but every single time I picked up the receiver and said hello, there was never anyone on the other end, just a heavy dead silence. There was also a magnetic loop sensor buried in the concrete driveway outside. That system was designed to make a loud chiming noise inside the warehouse to let the staff know when a customer car was pulling up to the loading dock. And sure enough, that loud chime would go off in the middle of the night when there was absolutely nobody sitting in the driveway. All of these electronic systems worked perfectly fine during the bright daylight hours when my other coworkers were walking around the facility. But the exact moment the sun went down and the regular customers became less frequent, the technical weirdness started. It was not just my imagination either. I had talked to my other colleagues who often covered the late closing shift with me, and they had experienced every single one of these anomalies as well. It was incredibly common for daily customers to casually tell me that their large donations were the direct result of cleaning out a recently deceased relative house. Because of that heavy history attached to the items, I am absolutely convinced that there were active ghosts all up in that warehouse. The atmosphere in that warehouse no longer leaves me any moments of peace. I carry with me the absolute certainty that the ghosts of all those deceased people stayed trapped inside their belongings, which still sit along the aisles of used merchandise. The absolute worst part is knowing that, while I sleep soundly in my bed, the sensor at that entrance keeps triggering in the middle of the night, warning that something intangible has just arrived at the donation center. If you like these stories, make sure to subscribe to the Reddit Oracle.